NASA has decided that Butch and Sonny will return with Crew 9 next February.
It looks like Boeing's Starliner is having another hiccup. This didn't faze Elon Musk, the maverick and SpaceX entrepreneur. He was right about the Boeing project all along. I wonder if Musk will step in to help. How is he going to show that SpaceX is now the more technologically advanced and dominant player in space exploration? Let's take a look at these rivals in the controversial world of spacecrafts, Boeing's golden age and the start of its decline. It's hard to imagine that Boeing could make such a significant misstep given their history. They've been around for a while, haven't they? For years, Boeing was the company everyone trusted to build things that flew, from airplanes to spacecraft. They were the industry leader in aerospace innovation. But then came the Starliner fiasco, and it made you wonder if all that shiny metal was really worth it. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's take a moment to remember what Boeing was like during their heyday. Boeing was known for building aircraft. They were instrumental in developing the rocket that took people to the moon, the space shuttle, and parts of the International Space Station. People were confident that Boeing would lead the way in the next phase of space exploration. But then Boeing hit a few snags with the Starliner project. Boeing was there, right at the height of NASA's achievements and innovations in space exploration. Boeing helped develop the Space Shuttle program by contributing to different parts of the shuttle's construction and design. They also helped put together parts for the International Space Station and built some of the most important American modules for the station to work with. Plus, they played a part in developing the Delta IV rocket, which has been used on space missions. This shows that they have a strong track record in space technology and exploration. At the time, it was only logical to put your trust in them when it came to the future of space exploration. When NASA picked Boeing to spearhead their Crew program, it was a choice that didn't come as a shock to many. Boeing was the reliable choice, the one you could count on thanks to their track record of successful outcomes. Even though there had been a change in their performance over time, they were still the safe bet. As time went on, it became obvious that this wasn't the same Boeing that had played a part in sending astronauts to the moon. This particular Boeing is a whole different ballgame. That's when things really started to get interesting. The merger with McDonnell Douglas. If we cast our minds back, we can see that there were some warning signs. Boeing's problems started way back with their 1997 acquisition of McDonnell Douglas. While it seemed like a smart move at the time, paying $4 billion for their competitor had an unexpected consequence. It changed the core identity of Boeing. Before the merger with McDonnell Douglas, Boeing was a company driven by engineers. Safety and quality were their top priorities. But McDonnell Douglas brought a more corporate focus on profits and shareholder value, which slowly started to chip away at Boeing's long-standing focus on engineering excellence. It's been said that McDonnell Douglas effectively bought Boeing with Boeing's own money, which shows how this merger really changed the company's values and priorities. The merger with McDonnell Douglas slowly changed the culture at Boeing, which had always been very engineering focused. The company's focus shifted from creating amazing aircraft and spacecraft to cutting costs and pleasing shareholders. Once they were the best in the business, the engineers were pushed out and the company's standards fell. This wasn't immediately apparent, but it contributed to issues like the Starliner debacle. The company that used to be all about cutting-edge innovation and safety had lost its way a bit, focusing too much on the bottom line. Let's have a quick chat about the Starliner project. Boeing is going through a rough patch. The Starliner project, which kicked off in 2010 as part of NASA's Commercial Crew program, has had a series of hiccups that mirrored a cultural shift within Boeing. Boeing, a big player in the aerospace industry, seemed like a natural fit for the job of developing a new spacecraft to take astronauts to the International Space Station. Boeing was initially given $18 million by NASA to get the job done by 2015. However, this proved to be a bit ambitious. They missed the deadlines and asked for more time. By 2015, the test flight was still not ready and had been pushed back to 2017 and then again to 2019. This led to some pretty serious concerns. What was causing these delays? Where was the Boeing we all knew and loved for getting those complex projects like the Lunar rover and the Space Shuttle done on time and to such high standards? It's only fair to ask why NASA kept giving Boeing extensions. Boeing operated under advantageous cost-plus contracts for years, which meant they could bill the government for all expenses plus a fee. This meant they made more money the more they spent. This system didn't really encourage efficiency or timeliness. But the Starliner contract was different. It was a fixed-price agreement, so Boeing was on the hook for any cost overruns, which directly impacted their profits. This change in financial structure showed that there were problems with how Boeing was doing things. They were used to having a lot of freedom to spend, so now they had to be more careful with their money. The leadership, still influenced by the McDonnell Douglas mindset, put cost-cutting first and foremost. This approach wasn't ideal for a complex project like spacecraft development. By the time Starliner took off on its uncrewed test flight in December 2019, it was clear that these decisions were going to have consequences. This test, which was meant to show that Boeing was still leading the way in aerospace, actually showed that there were problems with their system. The first test flight of the Starliner was a complete failure. A simple mistake, an incorrectly set clock, meant the whole mission was off course. This meant Starliner couldn't keep track of its mission timeline, and instead of heading towards the International Space Station, it ended up going off course. While Boeing eventually found the issue, it was too late to fix the mission. Starliner had already used too much fuel, so the mission had to be aborted. As if that wasn't bad enough, another software bug was found just 2 hours before re-entry. This bug could have caused the thrusters to misfire, which would have led to a catastrophic collision between the crew capsule and the service module. Thankfully, this was resolved in time, but it was a very public close call. Even though Starliner made it back to Earth safely, Boeing's reputation took a bit of a hit. This showed that cutting costs without paying enough attention to engineering is a risky move. Let's look at the Starliner and SpaceX and see how they differ, as well as what challenges they've faced. It's worth mentioning that Boeing wasn't the only company involved in NASA's Commercial Crew Program. NASA also joined forces with a younger, more dynamic company, SpaceX. This led to a great rivalry between the established giant and the ambitious newcomer. As you might have guessed, the newcomer came out on top. In 2014, NASA decided to split its commercial crew contracts between Boeing and SpaceX. This initially seemed like a good plan of action. Boeing, the seasoned veteran with lots of experience in the aerospace industry, versus SpaceX, the ambitious newcomer with innovative ideas but limited experience in human spaceflight. It seemed like a smart move to back both established expertise and fresh innovation. Boeing landed a hefty $4.2 billion contract for Starliner, while SpaceX got a smaller $2.6 billion contract for their Crew Dragon capsule. Most people thought that Boeing, with its history and experience, would get the job done faster and more efficiently. But in the end, SpaceX came out on top. So what was the reason for that? It's down to the difference in culture. These two companies ended up going in different directions because of their different approaches to things. Boeing stuck with what had worked before, while SpaceX went in a completely different direction. One of the main reasons for the difference was down to their respective cultures. At SpaceX, the engineers are still in charge, and they're inspired by Elon Musk's vision. Musk, who's known for pushing boundaries, created a culture where innovation wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. At SpaceX, they don't see failure as a disaster to be avoided. They see it as a chance to learn. This way of thinking meant they could make quick changes, learn from mistakes, and fix them quickly. This agile approach was a big contrast to Boeing's more cautious approach, which helped SpaceX catch up in the race to develop a reliable and efficient spacecraft. It's a fast-paced, agile culture that encourages quick iterations, experimentation, and learning from mistakes. Engineers are encouraged to take risks and think in new ways, which makes for a really innovative environment. Boeing was held back by its corporate culture, which put shareholder interest before taking on daring engineering projects. This way of thinking stayed with Starliner throughout its development. The decisions that were made were driven by money rather than engineering, which was a bad move in the space exploration industry. Sometimes the traditional, hierarchical corporate structures that focus on established processes and risk aversion can lead to slower decision-making and a reluctance to embrace radical innovation. Astronaut Doug Hurley has worked with both Boeing and SpaceX, so he's seen this contrast firsthand. He said that working with the SpaceX engineers was a great experience. They were open and flexible, and they took on board feedback from astronauts. He found that the Boeing engineers were overconfident, didn't listen to what the astronauts had to say, and were resistant to change. This different approach was the start of Boeing losing out in the space race. It just goes to show how crucial it is to have a flexible and responsive engineering culture if you want to achieve ambitious goals. The International Space Station. This was a big win for NASA and the US. It means the country can send astronauts to the ISS independently again, after years of relying on Russian spacecraft. The Demo 2 mission was a complete success. SpaceX had delivered on its promises, and then some, exceeding NASA's expectations. Elon Musk proved that SpaceX was more than just an ambitious startup. It was a major player in the aerospace industry. This showed just how powerful innovation, agility, and a willingness to take risks can be, and how they helped SpaceX to outpace its more established competitor. While SpaceX was doing well, Boeing was still having trouble with the Starliner. The 2019 test flight issues led to a rethink, but there were further problems. In 2021, a launch attempt was thwarted by malfunctioning fuel valves, which caused another setback and delayed the project even further. As SpaceX celebrated the success of the Crew Dragon, there was a bit of a blame game going on between Boeing and Aerojet Rocketdyne, the thruster manufacturer, over the faulty valves. This public disagreement between two major aerospace companies didn't exactly inspire confidence in Boeing's ability to deliver. Despite finally reaching orbit and docking with the ISS in 2022, the Starliner still had more thruster problems. The mission was a success, but the numerous issues showed that the company was struggling to maintain control. This was in stark contrast to SpaceX's seemingly effortless progress. While Boeing was still trying to get over the hurdles it had hit, SpaceX was already looking ahead to some pretty ambitious goals. Like a human mission to Mars, the gap between the two companies had become a chasm, showing just how much of an impact Boeing's cultural and operational challenges were having. SpaceX had become NASA's go-to for crewed missions, while Boeing's reputation was in tatters. Given the uncertainty around the Starliner thruster issues, NASA decided to prioritize astronaut safety and made the difficult call to return Wilmore and Williams to Earth on SpaceX's Crew Dragon instead. This was a bit of a knock to Boeing, showing that they've still got work to do to get a reliable spacecraft that can safely take astronauts to space. It also highlighted the growing gap between the two companies. SpaceX has been getting the thumbs up with Crew Dragon, while Boeing has been struggling with technical issues with Starliner. NASA's decision cemented SpaceX's position as the market leader in commercial human spaceflight, leaving Boeing to deal with the consequences of its failures. How did we end up here? As we've seen, Boeing's problems are down to a cultural shift that's been going on for a while. The company's dedication to engineering excellence had been diluted by a focus on cutting costs and pleasing shareholders. This change, which started decades ago with the McDonnell-Douglas merger, has now reached a point where it's causing real problems. Let's look at the specific reasons why Starliner failed just when it was needed the most. The June 2024 Starliner mission threw NASA and Boeing a bit of a curveball. The initial assessment said that the Teflon seals in the oxygen valves had expanded due to heat, but the issue didn't seem to make sense. These thrusters had performed perfectly in previous missions, and strangely, the problem was impossible to find in subsequent tests on the ISS. This lack of clear answers put Boeing in a tricky spot. Without knowing what was causing it, it was impossible to guarantee that the thruster would work properly during the crucial re-entry phase. NASA couldn't afford to take any risks. Astronaut safety was the top priority, and the potential consequences of thruster failure during re-entry were simply unacceptable. This wasn't just a minor software glitch. It was a matter of life and death, and there was no room for error. The June 2024 Starliner mission left NASA and Boeing scratching their heads over a puzzling issue: malfunctioning thrusters. It seemed like the problem was caused by heat expanding the Teflon seals in the oxygen valves, but the fact that it kept happening was really worrying. These thrusters had worked perfectly in previous missions, and further testing on the ISS didn't yield any clear results. This confusion put Boeing in a tricky spot. Without knowing what was causing it, it was impossible to guarantee the crew's safety. NASA, putting astronaut safety first, made the tough call to postpone the return flight for now. This meant the astronauts, Wilmore and Williams, would be staying on the ISS for a lot longer than planned. Williams and Wilmore were chosen to be the first astronauts to fly on Boeing's Starliner spacecraft as part of its crew flight test. Their mission was to test the spacecraft's capabilities and pave the way for future crewed missions to the ISS. However, because of the technical problems they had during the mission, they ended up staying on the ISS for a lot longer than planned and finally came back to Earth on SpaceX's Crew Dragon. Despite the difficulties they encountered, Williams and Wilmore displayed great professionalism and resilience throughout the mission. They were a huge help in managing the unexpected situation and contributing to the ongoing efforts to improve the safety and reliability of human spaceflight. While the Starliner issues caused a lot of disruption and inconvenience, the astronauts were never in a life-threatening situation. The ISS and its support systems kept them safe and well throughout their long stay. Even though things were getting more and more uncertain, Boeing kept up a brave front, saying publicly that Starliner was safe and could bring the crew back at any time. But behind the scenes, things were far less positive. Boeing engineers were racing to find the problem, while NASA was still not convinced that Starliner was ready for a crewed re-entry. By August 2024, we finally figured out what was going on. It turns out that the Teflon seals in the thruster valves were overheating and expanding, which was restricting the flow of oxidizer and causing the thrusters to shut down. While this helped to shed some light on the situation, it didn't explain why the issue hadn't been flagged earlier. To this day, Boeing still doesn't have a clear answer. On top of that, NASA's still not convinced about the safety of Starliner, decided to bring the spacecraft back to Earth without its crew. This decision was a big admission from Boeing that the program was struggling. It was a significant blow to their reputation and also disrupted NASA's carefully planned flight schedule. Here's why this was a big problem for NASA. SpaceX's Crew Dragon had to step in once again to rescue astronauts Wilmore and Williams, who were stranded on the ISS due to Starliner issues. The only option that made sense was to bring them back on board the Crew Dragon. However, Crew Dragon wasn't designed to accommodate 2 extra passengers. To get the stranded astronauts back, NASA had to remove 2 astronauts from the next scheduled Crew Dragon flight, leaving 2 empty seats. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a complete logistical nightmare. It threw a spanner in the works for NASA, messing up their flight schedule and affecting future missions, as well as causing a whole chain of delays and complications. It all came down to Boeing not being able to deliver on its promises. And this is what the Starliner saga is really about. A story of unfulfilled potential, technical setbacks, and the far-reaching consequences of a company struggling to keep pace with the evolving demands of space exploration. The situation also showed how well space agencies can handle crises and how important SpaceX is to NASA. It became clear that we needed reliable alternatives, which led to more discussions about redundancy and flexibility in spacecraft design and mission planning. This showed how linked the fortunes of commercial space firms and national space agendas are. And it changed the landscape of orbital logistics. Boeing was in a tricky spot in 2024. It was unclear whether Starliner would continue, and the company's reputation had taken a hit. NASA was starting to wonder if they could really depend on Boeing. And Boeing's finances weren't looking too good. Boeing had 2 choices. They could cancel the Starliner program or keep investing in it. Both options had their risks. Canceling would stop the money problems, but it would also mean losing the government contract. There was a risk in continuing to invest in Starliner because there was no guarantee of success. On top of that, the International Space Station was set to be decommissioned soon, which would limit the market for sending astronauts to low Earth orbit. This put Boeing in a tough spot, forcing them to take a step back and rethink their priorities in the aerospace industry. With the ISS set to be decommissioned, there was a real urgency to innovate or risk becoming obsolete.